Well, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I think we have a great presentation in store. My name is Kent Doty. I am the Coastal Conservation Coordinator for the Seven Capes Bird Alliance. This is the first in a series of webinars titled Your Data is for the Birds. And tonight we are very pleased to have Will Kennerley with us. And his topic will be How can photography help us learn more about Oregon seabirds? Special thanks to our partners who helped make this possible: Cascade Head, Mid-Willamette Bird Alliance, and Oregon Birding Association. Please visit their websites to learn more about each of them, but thank you to them for making this possible. Seven Capes Bird Alliance was founded in 2005. Our mission is to connect people with birds and wildlife and to protect their habitats. Our service area is Lincoln and Tillamook counties, and we've got three core program areas: education, community science, and conservation. Please visit us at sevencapes.org to learn more about the organization and membership. We have 281 members, very active. We have monthly bird walks, work on a lot of conservation issues and education, and do programs like tonight's program. Don't miss out the next in the series. Your data is for the birds. On November 5th, same time, 6 p.m., we'll be having a webinar, 125 Years of Audubon's Christmas Count by Cooper Farr. That should be very informative, and it'll give you a good introduction to the Christmas birding counts, which are a lot of fun. I think obviously they're a week before, after, they're right around Christmas time, but people gather together and try to do a countywide count of birds. And like I said, they've been going on 125 years. I think the survey in Tillamook County is possibly 100 years been going on. So it's a lot of fun. I encourage whether you are an expert birder or just a beginner to participate in that, but be sure and catch that webinar. Before we begin, I'm going to ask my coworker Nissa Parker to read the land acknowledgement statement.
Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the dispossession they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and act collectively as part of existing confederations. As we engage with the wildlife and environment that surrounds us today, we pledge to learn from these nations within the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, as well as our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We look forward to collaborating on common goals.
Thank you, Nissa. And by the way, tonight's program is being recorded, and we will make that recording available on our website. So if you miss this or have friends that want to see it, it'll be available. We are very pleased tonight to have Will Kennerley with us. Will is a faculty research assistant at the Seabird Oceanography Lab at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center. He first came to the Hatfield in 2020 to earn his master's degree, during which he researched foraging ecology of Atlantic puffins. He's in love with Oregon seabirds, and he's done graduate work since completing his degree in 2023. He shifted his focus to the incredible seabirds in the Northwest. He now works on diverse research projects, including monitoring seabirds at Uquinna Head, performing seabird surveys of marbled murrelets, and serving as the lead contact on the Birds with Fish community science project. And that's what we'll be hearing about. So a very warm welcome to Will. Before he begins, Will will share his knowledge on this topic for about 40 minutes, then we'll open it for question and answers. If you want to pose, if you think of a question, just put it in the Q&A chat button located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take questions and respond to them after the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Will.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to everyone tonight, and be able to talk about a subject that I'm really passionate about. And that's all the ways that we can use photography to help us learn more about the Oregon Coast seabirds. First, I have to recognize that I'm the one presenting today, but this is all the work of a ton of people, including all of my collaborators within the Seabird Oceanography Lab. Adam and Alexa are two great research assistants who are involved in many of the same projects as myself. And our lab is being led by Dr. Rachel Orban, who some of you may have seen at some other presentations in the area. And our lab is, really excited to say that we do work with a ton of different seabird species all over the world. And as I sort of did a mental list in preparation for this presentation, I was running through all the different kinds of work we do and realized that seabirds are involved in photography is involved in basically every one of these research projects in varying capacities. One of the projects that I work on is we're interested in censusing breeding populations of water birds in the Columbia River Basin. So this is California ring-billed gulls, double-crested cormorants, Caspian terns. And we do this primarily by doing aerial surveys, which allow us to cover a huge amount of ground in a single day. We can photograph many colonies and get photos like this. And then we're able to count these on a program which is called .goose. We're able to put all these little dots on all the breeding California gulls in this case, and essentially get colony counts. And that's great. We can cover so many more colonies in the same amount of time than we could just trying to do this traditional methods on the water, on foot, going through a colony, and cause way less disturbance. And using these data, we're able to compare population trends of breeding birds over time. In this case, before and after management actions, but this could, of course, also really critically show changes in response to any sorts of environmental or anthropogenic changes. Photography is also incredible for documenting interesting sightings or behaviors. I've been lucky enough to do a number of at-sea surveys, spending a lot of time off the coast of Oregon and Northern California to look at seabird use of offshore wind areas or areas potentially slated for offshore wind. See if there are areas we can hopefully recommend that have minimal impacts. And this is actually not a bird, I apologize for that, but while out 50 kilometers off of Humboldt County, I ended up seeing what at first I thought was a storm petrel and turned out to be a hoary bat 50 kilometers offshore. And we had a lot of great, marine mammals, seabird observers, oceanographers on board. Certainly nobody that knows much of anything about bats. It was really only because of these photographs I was able to reach out to some knowledgeable bat scientists. We were able to put together this is actually the first time hoary bats had been seen offshore. And it happened to be right in the middle of the Humboldt wind energy area. So we were able to publish that note thanks to these photographs and hopefully draw attention to the fact that it's not even just birds and marine mammals using these areas, but also potentially migratory bats. Cameras are also great for monitoring birds at breeding colonies or remote settings, things that involve a lot of time. And our former grad student in our lab, Luke Stuntz, did a lot of great research on mammalian predators of storm petrels and other seabirds on the south coast. This is a photo of Hunter's Island. Had the pleasure of working out there a few times. It's remote, hard to get to. It's steep, cliffy sides. It's not a a place where you can, count on getting out there. It would be really hard to do regular, reliable field surveys. And so setting up trail cameras was great to document the presence of mink and river otters and some other predators. And also to document occasions of, say, these predators feeding on seabirds. Here we have a river otter with a gull chick. We're actually able to quantify some of these impacts by using, randomly set out arrays of trail cameras. Just in capture evidence of these predation events in ways that there's no way we could do, relying on in-person observation. And of course, photography is also incredible for, outreach and educational materials. Our jobs as scientists are to collect data and to produce results that hopefully have meaningful impact for the environment and society. But our results are completely meaningless if we can't communicate them to a lot of people. Just publishing another study that goes to a journal and sits on a university library shelf and never gets read is, not worth the time of day. And we've had a couple of interns, actually. A lot of these are by former intern of the labs, Clara Oliverson, who, in addition to collecting research, she was able to, she puts it, take photos that tell stories. She got to come along on a lot of other research projects going on the Oregon coast and document the activities and the findings of some of these projects and really bring that home to people. Seabirds kind of suffer from the fact that they tend to occur in remote areas or far out at sea, away from people's, everyday life. And so it's pretty easy for most people to forget about them. And so these photos are really, really powerful ways of bringing birds and bird research into their everyday lives. And then on the subject of more about what I'm here to talk about is photography is also great for collecting bird diet. So I worked with Atlantic puffins in a number of places, especially in Britain, the UK. They'll collect diet samples of birds using mist nets. So we'll see the birds flying in with their fish, and they can catch them in mist nets, at which times they can do some really important things like putting on bands, taking measurements or collecting, some feather samples. But of course, this is pretty disturbing to the bird. They don't get hurt, but naturally this causes stress. And they can collect the food samples this way, collect all the fish that the birds drop while in the net. But of course, that takes away a meal from the chick, which is harder to justify in some of the colonies where the birds aren't doing as well. And another common way people will assess seabird diet is using, these pellets, which are coughed up by birds such as gulls and cormorants. And sometimes other researchers will go collect these pellets and identify the hard parts, and you can tell what kinds of fish they're eating. But in addition to being incredibly labor intensive, to do that, you have to go into the colonies and either hope there are some left there at the end of the breeding season, which is no sure thing, or cause a lot of disturbance. And so photography is just incredible for collecting these kinds of diet data, but non-invasively. Generally able to cause no or very, very minimal disturbance to the birds and preserve the fragile nesting habitat. For those of you who've been out to Haystack Rock here, know that the island's covered in this turf, or thin layer of turf that sits on the rocks. It's really easy to cause damage to it, to cause erosion. There are also storm petrels and puffins breeding in that turf. It's really easy to cause a lot of damage and pretty much impossible to do any, research involving people climbing up without causing a lot of damage. And until, the advent of really, high quality digital cameras, we weren't really able to study things like puffin diet here. And in addition, it of course keeps the observer safe too. Most of the islands in Oregon's coast are pretty precipitous. They can be pretty dangerous places to work. So if we're able to keep our feet on solid ground, that's even better. And since the advent of these really high quality, super zoom digital cameras, there's been a lot of work in the peer-reviewed literature that supports that digital photography is, a pretty reliable way to assess seabird diet. There's been a couple of studies that have compared multiple methods of assessing diet. we found that digital photography can work, and that actually you can get great results by crowdsourcing, essentially, photos from the community. And that could be a really great cost-effective way to get large data sets to study threatened or endangered birds. And of course, we have to know, it's really critical for us to know about a bird's diet because it's essentially the most fundamental aspect of its biology. I think we all spent some time in middle school, high school biology classes looking at food webs like this. So it's easy to forget that this is actually something that's really important and that we don't actually have the information for a lot of species. And so without it, it can be pretty much impossible to plan effective conservation measures. You don't know anything about the diet. You don't know what's going to impact that or what abiotic or biotic factors. What are the limiting factors preventing, say, species recovery? What qualifies as important habitat? So it's really critical to understand these really basic biology questions, which are pretty easy to ignore in a really society, including scientific society, that really loves, glamorous studies. But really the basics are extremely critical to focus on. But because there's a ton of species of birds that need our concern, and many areas under threat from all sorts of different anthropogenic and natural sources of concern, we often have to borrow these data from other regions or populations. So typically you can look for, say what your study species is eating in a neighboring region, or potentially find a closely related species and use those data. And oftentimes that works great. It's pretty common if you look in the scientific literature for people to be able to borrow things from neighboring populations. But just as a little warning sign, the two best studied common mer colonies on the West Coast are most abundant breeding seabird, are at the Farallones and just in our neighborhood at Uquina Head. So because, they're the same species feeding both in the Northern California current system, large colonies, you might expect they'd be feeding on pretty similar things. As it turns out, these birds down in California are not behaving just like the birds up here in Oregon. And they're actually relying on some very different prey types. The California birds feeding very heavily on juvenile rockfishes, whereas these are very uncommon in the diet of the Oregon, the Uquina Head common mers, which instead tend to rely a lot on smelts. So by borrowing data from an adjacent population, which seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do in this case, we would have been pretty misinformed in identifying what species are critical for common conservation here. And so, of course, for scientists, I think our best takeaway, as with local consumers, is shopping local is one of the best things you can do. If there's data from your region for your study species that you can use, then that's going to be almost without exception, the best option. So that's been some of the inspiration behind several of our research projects, where we try to collect our own data, even if it seems like this is understood in other regions. Because we're finding increasingly, especially with climate change, the different regions are experiencing change at different rates. And it can be helpful to have a lot more data points to understand how birds might be affected. So for a number of years now at Uquina Head, we've been taking photos of common mers bringing back fish for their chicks. Often we've used actually this kind of funny looking setup that works really well. It's a digital camera with a special mount onto a spotting scope, which works better than a lot of other camera setups because the birds are 200, even 300 meters away. It'd be really hard to get photos any other way. But we're able to get identifiable, maybe not museum worthy, but identifiable photos of birds with fish here. Common mers bringing back smelts, herrings, flatfishes, a little bit of rockfish, and this one here in the middle actually has a young lingcod, which is kind of an exciting thing that we don't see very often. as I mentioned earlier, they're feeding largely on smelt, but this changes year to year. By collecting all these photos and identifying the fish within them, using the same methodology in successive years, we can start to put together these really valuable time series. And it's only with things like this that we can actually understand how, environmental change, be it things like, El Nino or climate change, we can actually understand how changing prey bases are affecting common bird diet. So we see it's not the same kind of same sort of color scheme, which each color is representing a different kind of fish, and each of the individual columns represents a different year of study at Yaquina Head. So we see some years have a lot of this green color, which is herrings and sardines. Other years have a lot of this purple color, which is Pacific sand lance. And other years, especially the later ones, have a lot of orange. So these are the smelts. And so we're able to see that each year seems to be a little bit different. And by understanding how the prey composition of bird diet varies, we can ask a lot of other questions from that point. So we can say, what's causing that change? Is it in the environment? Is it because of human fisheries? And of course, does this have any impact on the birds? And this was a big part of the research of a former grad student in our lab, Amanda Gladix, who led the Yaquina Head monitoring efforts for a number of years. In her published master's work, she found that interannual variation in bird diet was basically driven by these, big environmental factors, both at a really local scale, so things like just the temperature of the water within the bird foraging range, but also things acting on huge ocean-wide scales, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and El Nino. So there's a lot of different environmental factors that are impacting the kinds of fish. And then through the fish, those environmental factors are impacting the reproductive success of common birds. So that when certain types of fish, especially like smelt or sand lance predominated, the MERS tended to do well. But when other kinds of fish dominated, they tended not to do as well and didn't raise as many chicks. And we've continued this work since, so we now have one of the longest, more or less continuous common bird diet data sets. Certainly one of the longest on the West Coast. And I apologize, I've switched the colors around on you here in this time series, but the green colors here are the smelts. And you can see how in the beginning, they're pretty moderately represented in common bird diet, but have been seen increasingly frequently and now dominate bird diet. Smelts are incredibly important to the breeding success of the common birds here. And that's really valuable to know, and that we can hopefully, try to raise more awareness about this and get more research into the forage fish communities here funded. And we've been doing this for, several decades now. We have plans to keep going to continue this work, despite the budgetary problems they might try to throw at us, to continue monitoring how a changing environment is actually impacting the food available to MERS, and thus how the MERS are able to reproduce. These data get used pretty widely. They go not only into scientific publications like Amanda's I shared, but we do annual colony monitoring reports to a lot of the collaborative agencies we work with. This includes a lot of the data that we collect at Yaquina Head and some Depot Bay colonies. So things like the number of chicks that MERS and cormorants are raising, how many eagle disturbances there were, how many birds they actually, common MERS they ate. And we are able to share that with Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, to hopefully let them make informed management and conservation decisions, hopefully give them the tools they need to make the best informed decision. You see that also gets shared beyond, the local Central Oregon coast scale. The bird diet data especially has been shown in other studies to be pretty representative of what kinds of fish there are in the greater environment. And it's not just MERS that eat these fish, it's, things that people who are, maybe more interested in just sort of economic stats, they can actually really relate to this, because those same things that MERS are eating, tuna and salmon at sea, they're also really relying on some of these fish. And so we share these data with NOAA for some of their annual series of reports and publications, like Soccer, the State of the California Current report, or the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment. These reports are great because they get shared with a lot of agencies that work within or with NOAA, and are able to provide great context for, say, the Pacific Marine Fisheries Council, as they assess, say, not only what kind of year was it, what did these environmental changes actually mean for everything from, nutrients in the water to the abundance of plankton like copepods, what kinds of forage fish there are, and how is this going to affect, say, fisheries in our coastal human societies. So we're able to provide these data, just making up a little part, really broad-ranging work that NOAA does. Hopefully set excellent fisheries management quotas, targets, and ensure that we have resilient coastal human communities as well. So over these several decades of work that you went ahead, we've learned that billboard photography can be really effective for assessing seabird diet. As I mentioned earlier, it not only causes way less disturbance to the birds, but for the person actually collecting the data, you don't have to know much about fish identification. I've taken a lot of fish ID classes, both in undergrad and graduate school, and I'm still learning more and more every day. It can be pretty challenging, especially when the birds are holding half the fish in their bills and blocking that. So it could require a lot of training to have somebody out there collecting those data, just visually, just with a pair of binoculars or a scope. But we're able to have, some of our interns go out, collect those data, and that we can help them identify them, on a rainy day when we can't go in the field. We collect huge numbers of observations per day. If you're collecting a cormorant pellet, each cormorant's going to cough up maybe one pellet per day, but we can photograph huge numbers of these birds, bringing back incredible numbers of fish to their chicks. And of course, the image is preserved, which is great. If somebody reports a questionable sighting, you can go back and check that. If you think of something new that you can do with the work later on, it's basically preserved like a museum specimen, because of what these birds are doing. What did the fish look like? Were they in good body condition? Were they longer, shorter than normal? And so we've begun to assemble some larger data sets from both Quinahead and a number of other local colonies. And of course, this has made us wonder if we could use this for different species as well. And unfortunately, tufted puffins in Oregon are not doing that great, but have provided us with a great opportunity to test out if we can apply these methods for common MERS to this species as well. So as you're seeing in this chart, in the late 70s, during some of the first real comprehensive coast-wide surveys of Oregon seabird populations, they're estimated to be 6,500 tufted puffins breeding in Oregon. At the last assessment in 2021, they're thought to be only about 550. That's an incredible decline, 90% in 40 years. And the worst part of it is we still don't entirely understand why. There are a number of factors, certainly involved. We know there's been some vegetation changes and erosion to breeding colony sites. There's a lot of bycatch and some, at least at first, poorly managed fisheries. Some longline drift nets in the North Pacific killed thousands of tufted puffins. We think most of them were from Alaska, but we don't actually know where those birds are from. That very easily could have involved some Oregon birds too. And there have been some really severe El Nino events scattered throughout with increasing frequency in latter years, as well as some marine heat waves and increasing fisheries exploitation. So our group is essentially working with a lot of other researchers throughout the Northwest to try to solve why tufted puffins are declining so precipitously. And we're doing a lot of work on the puffins at Cannon Beach, at that haystack rock. Hopefully see, is it dietary changes how our breeding populations responding to dietary shifts. And we've received some great support from a number of different organizations. And that lets us fund one intern each year to, honestly, it sounds like a pretty killer job to spend the whole summer or June and July and August up at Cannon Beach, going out to photograph puffins every day. And they do some really great work, both as representatives of the species, being able to talk to people on the beach about puffin conservation, but also collect huge amounts of photo data that we can use to identify prey species, just like we do with common birds. So able to collect a lot of photos like this. And since 2022, we photographed 700 unique bill loads, and actually within the last few weeks received 2025 data that I haven't been able to look at yet. But I'm really excited to see how many bill loads and how many prey items we were able to capture this year. So stay tuned, these numbers will just go up. We also hope to support an intern up there in 2026 as well. And so we're just in the early days of assembling a time series, like you saw earlier. Each of these colors representing a different species, each of the years as a column. And again, you can see that with even with just 3 years here, every year, it's looking different from the last. See, in the first year, there was a good number of herring, a good bit of squid in this sort of goldish color. Whereas in the middle, we had a lot of this lighter blue color, which is generally low quality larval fish, kind of just look like little spaghetti noodles that the birds would be flying around with. And that's generally a pretty good indication that there are poor food resources around. There aren't many other bigger fish that are more calorie and nutrient rich to feed on. So that was really, at least important to document. Interested to see how often we see years like that, if we can assess how that impacted reproduction. But happily, 2024, we saw a lot of smelt, this greenish color, just large numbers of large smelt, as well as lots of this orange bar juvenile rockfishes. And we think 2024 was a really, really good year for green puffins up there. We were able to see and document them bringing in large numbers or large amounts of high quality prey. But with any diet study, we always have to worry, how representative are these data? Kind of concerningly, we had an all-star intern a couple summers ago, Aya, who was able to look at some of our preliminary common bird diet data at Yaquina Head, Depot Bay, and up at Haystack Rock, trying to see, are these birds eating the same things? And we found that actually there's generally eating all the same species, but the actual proportions of these species are varying between the sites. So, 2022 is not the same kind of year at Yaquina Head as it is up at Haystack Rock. And we're realizing that that's because foraging habitat matters. All of these sites, which she found is that have different amounts of, sandy bottoms, kelp forest, or rocky shores around. And so because there's different habitat available, these birds are feeding on the different species of fish that live in those habitats. And this shouldn't be too surprising. I think there's at least one way we've all seen birds vary their diets according to the habitat, especially those of us living here on the coast. We've all seen some of our coastal gulls feeding on crabs and sea stars and some other really natural prey, feeding at the herring run in Yaquina Bay, for instance. And we've all seen them eating a lot of human garbage as well, including this lucky bird who's eating a big pink frosted cookie that apparently it found. And so we all kind of know that if we're doing a study of, say, what the gulls of Newport, for instance, are eating, we're going to need to sample both of the sort of natural habitats at, say, South Beach State Park, but also down at the bayfront, if we actually want to get data that represents that whole area. So if we collect data from a number of different locations and over a longer period of time, hopefully our estimates of their diet is going to be closer to the truth, or at least as close as we can feasibly get. But of course, challenge of this, more data and more sites is a lot more effort, which really means more money. Um, we're blessed with a really long and beautiful coastline here in Oregon. But in this day and age, especially, resources are really scarce for traditional scientific research. Um, Seemingly getting scarcer by the day. So it's really hard to plan larger scale research projects in a time like this. But Oregon is really lucky to have a lot of really skilled birders and bird photographers that we think actually might be able to help us here. And that's really the inspiration behind the Birds with Fish project. So it's a community science initiative that Seabird Oceanography Lab at Oregon State is running. We're hoping to better understand the diets of Oregon's marine and estuarine birds, essentially by collecting donations in the form of photographs from birders and photographers on the Oregon coast. So these are just some of the photos that we've received submissions of. A lot of great photographers in the area, and actually pretty much, a large portion of the photos you've seen already in today's presentation have been submitted by some of our great contributors. And good news is almost anyone can help. If you have any photos of birds feeding while you're at the coast, and don't let the name fool you. It doesn't have to be fish, marine invertebrates, anything that you see these coastal birds feeding on is really valuable data for us. All you have to do is submit some of these photos online at the Birds with Fish website, which I'll share later. And just a few quick questions, and that's all you have to do. That's an extra, really valuable data point that you've donated to us. So birds with fish, squid, shellfish, marine invertebrates, doesn't have to be just fish. And it doesn't have to be, a truly oceanic bird. It doesn't have to be tufted puffins. Any of the birds that you see on our estuaries, coasts, or open ocean. So whether you're on a pelagic seeing, shearwaters feeding, or you're walking along the coast at Salishan and you see great blue herons, feeding on the shoreline. I think that's all great, awesome data that we can all benefit from and really contribute to some of our long-term ecological studies. Really, the only thing that is required to turn your photo from, some artwork into data is just having a little bit of accompanying information. So the date and location are really important. They're actually required for us to make usable, sense essentially of these photographs. We've had a lot of great luck with that so far. And are hoping you all can help us out with doing more. Submitting is really easy. This is a QR code for our website. I'll share it in a different form later on in this presentation if you prefer. But just on the website, you can go up to our photo submission link at the top. And clicking that, going to our photo submission page. There's a few guidelines for taking and submitting the best kinds of photos, some of which I'll cover later in this talk. But you can just clicking the submit photos here link will take you to a Google form. There's a little bit of information to read, but really there's just a couple of important questions. So maybe your name and your email, and your location. Where did you take these photos? Especially the nearest town, that would really help us. But if you're offshore, coordinates, something that'll help us pinpoint where these birds are feeding. And just let us know if your timestamps and your photos are correct. You don't have to give us individual dates and times for all your photos. If so, you can just click yes, and that's all we need. And we also recognize, some of the photographers here are professionals. They're, need their photo rights protected and are worried about that. So please just, answer this question. Let us know what we can use this for. It's totally fine if you say just for scientific purposes. We'll essentially, identify the fish, use some of the accompanying information, and forget we ever saw your photo. But if you want, you can click that we can use your photos for other purposes and, use them in some of our outreach presentations like tonight. You can help share your photos with the community. So just uploading down here at the bottom, upload up to 10 at a time. Or if you're somebody with a huge number of photos, please send me an email. We could work with you, maybe provide you with a hard drive that you can mail back to us or something like that. But over the last couple years of trying to get this project off the ground, lucky to have over 400 submissions, with more coming in weekly. And as you can see here on the map, where our coastal counties are colored on a scale of few photos to more photos, we're doing pretty well on the North Coast, a lot from Lincoln and Clatsop counties, as well as some from the South Coast, though we still need to do some more outreach and spreading awareness down there. Notably absent Douglas County, if anyone especially is birding down in Reedsport, Winchester Bay, we'd love to see your photos. We really have no data from our last coastal county to color. And we've gotten an incredible number of bird species, more than I ever anticipated, as well as prey types. So we've been able to get complete information and identifications made for 353 of our observations so far. A significant number of these are of alcids, so pigeon guillemots, tufted puffins, common murres. Perhaps this isn't too surprising because they really like to sit and hold their fish in their bills. Some of these pigeon guillemots are downright proud of the fish they've caught, and make really great targets for photographers. But we've been, lucky to receive a ton of different other species, so great blue herons, common loons, western gulls, and pelagic cormorants. These are all things that we see kind of all the time here if you go out birding, but we know remarkably little about what they're eating, especially on their wintering grounds here. So data from any of these species could be quite valuable. And already, even though we're hoping to get more observations in the future, we've been able to do some preliminary looks into what these birds are eating. So we received a lot of submissions from pigeon guillemots. Found that fully half of the birds photographed have been eating sculpins so far. There's also a lot of flatfishes, so maybe young sole that they've been eating, as well as rockfishes, some funny little eel-like fish called gunnels, as well as some crustaceans, other prey that they're finding on the bottom, on the seafloor. And because we're able to get some good location data, we can also break these down into ways that other research projects maybe aren't able to. Say comparing these diets across different habitats. So, are these pigeon guillemots feeding, in Tillamook Bay in an estuarine habitat like that? Or are they feeding off, Cascade Head in a marine, full ocean environment? In either case, we see sculpin. We think different species, but still some kind of sculpin is the dominant prey. But in the estuaries, flatfishes, so those young sole or things like that are really important. Whereas out on the open ocean, we see a lot more contribution from rockfishes. So once again, if we're only looking at one place, these data might show a kind of skewed version of what Oregon's pigeon guillemots are actually consuming. So as I mentioned before, it really only takes your date and location to make an observation useful. I showed some really incredible photos from a ton of really gifted photographers, some of whom might be online tonight, which I could say thank you. This is one that I took. I'm clearly not one of these skilled photographers. I don't have a big camera setup. I just use my cell phone up against my spotting scope or binoculars. And at some places can get perfectly, usable data just by doing that, even without a big camera setup. I have a date, I have a location, the metadata, my timestamps on my photo are correct, and that's really all we need. That's all you need to be able to submit important data. Don't worry if it's not a beautiful photo. So you don't have to know what kind of fish or invertebrate or even what kind of bird it is. So don't let that discourage you from submitting, mystery gulls that are impossible to identify. That's still an interesting data point. And of course, it doesn't have to be a National Geographic quality photo. Sometimes even with a cell phone or little point and shoot, you can get great photos at a dock or a jetty of birds feeding, and that's perfect. What is important, as I said, the date and location. And we're hoping to get pretty representative photo submissions. So, if you only submit the biggest and best fish that these birds found, we're going to get a skewed representation of what these birds are eating. Maybe it's going to say that they're eating tons of salmon, when that's really only a little bit. That just happens to be the biggest, most attractive thing they're eating. So, send us your ugly photos, send us your weird little prey being consumed. That's all representative of reality and will help us better learn about these birds and hopefully better conserve them in the future. And ideally, if you have multiple angles or photos from throughout the year, different locations, those are all great. And already we've been able to put these photos to use a little bit. So ODFW recently revised the conservation strategy, but now it's being called the State Wildlife Action Plan. And with some of these submissions, we've been able to check that some of our birds of conservation concern, like tufted puffins, not only that they're listed in the conservation strategy, but also some of their important prey species. So things like smelts have been listed, Pacific herring. And while the conservation strategy in itself doesn't provide, legal protection, it does provide a sort of tacit state endorsement of the conservation threat that these species are under. And we can't act on protecting prey species if we don't know that they're important for these birds. I think unfortunately we're all a little familiar with some of the cormorant problem on the Columbia River, where they're eating some endangered salmon, even though it's absolutely not the cormorant's fault that these salmon stocks are threatened. And it's been a really challenging management series of debacles, essentially. But there have been a couple silver linings in all this, a couple glimmers of hope. And essentially a lot of that's come from these research projects. So recognizing that, say, Brandt's cormorants consume a lot fewer salmon than double-breasteds do. So they've been saved from a lot of these unfortunate kind of violent calls. The colony location influences salmon predation. They were able to save a lot of these birds years ago by moving Caspian terns to a colony closer to the ocean, where they actually just had access to more food sources and so fed less on salmon, and actually at least minimize the impact that these birds were having. And good thing is that cormorant calls now require permits and prior study. When the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was first passed in the early 20th century, cormorants were still listed as a pest species. You could still legally go out and shoot them, which is kind of shocking to us nowadays. But it was only through this kind of diet work people realize they're not actually posing as much of a threat to sport commercial fishermen as you think. And that's actually been really important in helping convince people that, they deserve to be counted as a migratory bird too. And of course, these data hopefully going to help us understand, how our prey types and, say, the ocean conditions that influence prey abundance, how does all that influence our declining bird species? Well, hopefully, the better we understand what's driving these bird declines, we can hopefully, maybe better predict them or better mitigate these declines in the future. So we're hopeful that, just by learning more about the birds that we have here in Oregon, we can actually learn how to better protect them. We can't predict what we don't, or can't protect what we don't know or what we don't understand. And we'd love for your help us learn more about seabirds by sharing your photos with the Birds with Fish project. Here's a link to our website or the QR code if you prefer that. And also, again, my name is Will Kennerley. I'm the primary contact. Please email the project. Be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I'd love to leave this up for folks if you want to write down any of your information. And Kent, if there's any time, I'd love to take some questions.
Thanks, Will. Yes, we have plenty of time for questions. If people, I see there's one in there at the bottom of your screen, you should have a tab with toolbars and Q&A. You can type your question in that. Your toolbar may be on the top of your screen, but Will, just a fantastic presentation, especially the opportunities for uh, people to get involved in it. So let's take a question.
Yeah, again, we have plenty of time for questions, so if anybody wants to submit, please feel free. Our first question is a technical question from David Desert. I tried to submit Equina head photos a few months ago, but it seemed that no photos were being accepted. Did the website change or was it just down for a while?
Fortunately, David, you may have tried to contribute during those like 2 days that apparently we reached some sort of limit on the Google Drive. That problem's been addressed, and we'd still love to have your photos now. And if you have any issues, yeah, please let us know. We only actually even knew about it because somebody thankfully emailed us. We're very thankful for that person. So apologies for that.
Other questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. The webinar format doesn't allow us to open it up directly to ask questions. While we wait for questions, I have one, Will. Where are good local spots to go to take photographs of birds with fish?
Oh, yeah. Well, I live in Newport, so my answers are going to be a little bit Newport centric, but just any of the breeding colonies during the summer. So things like your Quinton Head, if you have a larger camera setup. The colony at Pirate Cove in Depot Bay is great. Or I've also had good luck just going along the jetties or down to the docks, the boat docks, and surprising how close you can get to some feeding loons and cormorants and some other birds like that. It's yeah, and then you don't have to have a nice setup too. So as I mentioned, ironically enough, I'm not a very good photographer myself, trying to get better at that. But those are situations that let somebody like me still, be able to take pretty good and usable photos.
Awesome. Well, in that time, we did get a couple more questions in, so we'll go ahead and read those out. This one is interesting. How do you prevent photos of the same bird and fish being counted multiple times, or does it make a difference?
Can't say we've had that as an issue before. Oftentimes these birds are pretty quick coming in, but the date and location, are really important. That's honestly kind of the only way that we could tell. I spent a lot of time identifying essentially identical looking photos of lures flying in all with the same looking smelt. So yeah, the accompanying metadata is really important in hopefully identifying those few cases if they do occur.
Okay. Lily would like to ask if it is okay for kids to submit photographs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to have contributions from anyone. And if you have any sort of privacy concerns, we've had folks submit, using their initials or something instead of their names. Or we don't have to use their photos in other capacities. But yeah, we'd love for everyone to submit if they have them. And to share with your friends. At the very least, hopefully this is a new fun thing to do on the coast and hopefully learn a little bit more about seabirds in the meantime.
Always good to get kids involved. Let's see. A question from Allison. Are there specific courses at OSU that you would recommend taking to learn more about seabirds and preparing for research?
That is an excellent question. So Rachel Orban, the professor leading our lab, I believe it's a marine and estuarine birds class within the Fish and Wildlife Department. That's tailored to that, to a very narrow topic that I'm very passionate about. Get to help out with that class sometimes, and it involves some field work down in Newport at Hatfield Marine Science Center. In classes like that, especially that involve some time outside, yeah, those are super valuable.
Awesome. Let's see. Still got questions coming in. Okay, a question from Peter. The DSLR plus scope setup looked pretty cool. How much would that cost, or could you point people in the direction for getting a similar setup?
I would have to look that up. That's been around since before I started with our program. But if there's a way, I'd be happy to send that information out later.
Another question from David. Let's see. Now that it's not breeding season, any advice on fruitful locations, beaches, offshore rocks, cliffs, etc., for feeding photos? As you noted, not all birds like to show off their catches.
Yeah. And so I was especially pleased that we were able to get some of those birds, pelagic cormorants or great blue herons, things that don't parade around with their fish. Um, and yeah, I think going back to just the docks or jetties have been really fruitful for me. I'm going out to South Jetty here in Newport, especially during the heron run, but really any time of year. Um, that can be a pretty good place to get reasonably close to birds and also see them feeding it in action, as it were, not just when they're coming back to the breeding colony.
That's all the questions that we have for right now. Let's leave it open for a couple minutes just to make sure that we get any questions answered that people have.
While we wait, I'll pose another question. Will, can you speak to any research that's looking at uh, change in composition or efficiency of feeding
Efficiency in
that's
feeding
due
is,
to climate change?
yeah, efficiency is a great question that a lot of people are interested in. It's also really hard to measure. Um, but one of the concerns is that with most fish being having the same body temperature as their surroundings, as the water. So when the water warms, a lot of these fish can actually react more quickly and swim faster. And so one of the concerns with climate change is actually, fish might be harder to catch. And some of the predatory fish might actually be more efficient competition for birds. I know there's some work on that. Kyle Elliott's lab looking up at in the Canadian Arctic, especially with thick-billed murres. They've done some great work showing that, yeah, different types of prey in the environment, uh, might be able to change the efficiency and how these birds are actually foraging. So that's a very challenging thing to study, but absolutely something we're interested in.
We did have a couple more questions come in. Is there an age requirement for the internships that you mentioned?
Um, generally, no. Traditionally, our interns have been undergraduate students. That's typically who we've worked with in the past. And in certain years, how the money comes in. Some agencies may want to sponsor an undergrad essentially to facilitate their career development. It might vary year to year, but typically undergrads are great. And then we can hopefully work with them, say, on senior thesis projects or things like that also. Hopefully not only have them help us collect data, but we can hopefully help them develop into biologists as well.
And another one from Allison. Let's see. It's an interesting question. How do you think current changes to policy are going to impact your work and seabird/coastal conservation?
Yeah, that's a really big question. Even when, say, funding or projects have been awarded, there's certainly no guarantee nowadays that, the money will actually show up. And so it's certainly impacted on what kinds of projects we can do and at least really how we tackle them. So, maybe it would be more efficient to, send a ton of interns out with really high powered cameras to 20 different sites on the Oregon coast, but there's absolutely not money for that. So it's forcing us hopefully to be creative in a positive way that hopefully lasts past some of these current problems. Think about new ways in how we can ask and answer some of these questions. We're all still really motivated to continue research, to continue working with these folks. We're just might have to be a little creative about it.
Interesting times for sure.
Yes.
Okay, we got yeah, one more question from David. I'm really excited about the citizen science contributions you've talked about. Are there other places where we can contribute? And we'll have a few more, some suggestions for other community science opportunities in our kind of concluding slides. But yeah, go ahead and feel free to answer if you have any that you know of.
Well, I know you'll have some people talking about eBird later on in this webinar series. That's, really awesome way to learn more about, say, the distributions, both in time and space of birds. I've recently become pretty interested in iNaturalist. We haven't used that in our professional settings, but hoping on the iNaturalist app where you can submit observations of birds, fish, plants, fungi, anything basically, with just a photo and a location. It's been a really great way to understand the distributions of species and hopefully, as the project builds, how they change over time. And you can also do these really cool things called projects within iNaturalist. We're hoping to establish a Birds with Fish project within that site. So you could upload, say a photo of a feeding bird and tag the Birds with Fish project. And we'll be able to essentially, contribute to two different kinds of, community science initiatives at the same time. So that's up and coming, but I really do recommend iNaturalist and eBird.
Yeah, we'll have another webinar in this series all about eBird. So the link where you registered for this webinar, you'll find that one. It's coming up in December. So we have the one about the Christmas bird count followed by eBird in December. So make sure to sign up for that if you're interested in the really huge data set community science project. And we've got a couple more questions coming in. Do you think bird populations living near each other impact each other's diets?
Yeah, definitely. There's some record I'm thinking of, especially from gannets in the UK, that nobody really knows how they're doing this, but it seems like each colony has its own foraging area. And the birds from adjacent colonies won't feed, in each other's territory, as it were. We have no idea how they know this. But this is presumably to mitigate or to minimize competition between these birds of the same species by foraging in different areas. But of course, since diet can vary based on habitat, they're influencing each other's diet, inadvertently. We also know competition. There might actually be more common birds now than there were, at the first time of European contact here in Oregon. And that could be because of, say, lessened human activity on these colonies. But we have no idea how those, increased in common bird populations could have impacted seabird community or forage fish community here. So yeah, these birds are definitely impacting how the others are feeding, even if it's not through direct competition.
And a couple more related questions. Do seabird diets changed with the breeding season?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So some of my master's work with Atlantic puffins, and some other projects related to that, we were able to find that, say, Atlantic puffins were feeding on a lot of maybe really common but lower quality fish and prey during the non-breeding period. But during the breeding season, which is really exhausting, these birds are commuting a lot of distance. They have to raise a chick also. They're tied to the foraging colony. They can't move wherever the best food is. So they're really selecting the highest quality fish in their diet. Our diet studies can show that they're actually feeding more and more on herring, or more reliant on, say, the best fish in that system than they are at other times of the year. So yeah, absolutely. And that's part of why we'd love to get photos. If you happen to see nurse feeding in the winter off of one of the jetties or something here, that's a big knowledge gap here. Actually, we'd love to see those photos.
Good to know. Another similarly related question. Does migration impact your research, or do you track diet across migration paths for the birds that do migrate?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So far our project's been really place-based, essentially. Essentially on the Northwest coast, Oregon in particular. So for those birds that come seasonally and then migrate elsewhere, I suppose you could say that falls a little bit out of our purview. But hopefully some other projects are able to learn about that. But yeah, it definitely is a challenge with migrating birds. They certainly could be eating different things at different places. And that's also really hard for us to study.
That's all of the open questions that we have right now. Oh, here's another one. I keep speaking too soon. Do you think you will partner with other places along the coast or those migration paths, or do you already, to kind of answer more of those questions about migration and feeding, the relationship between migration and feeding habits?
Yeah. Well, we're hoping to eventually build up a larger data set here, the Birds with Fish project, and hopefully have some of say our our lab, all of our members belong to say the Pacific Seabird group, another group of researchers, Seabird researchers from throughout the world. Hopefully, if we are able to share and present some of the data there, we're able to connect with people that on those migration routes might know what some of our birds are feeding at different times of the year, or at the very least, we could hopefully make some of those connections. With some of these large scale migrations, these are certainly things that no one person can do by themselves. So we're really trying to make as many connections as we can and help answer those questions.
And we final call for questions. Have seabird diets reflected any patterns between other species that feed on fish?
Yes, another part of our former grad student, Amanda Gladys's work, showed that, there were actually some patterns. I believe she looked at rockfish. Can't remember, unfortunately, what kind of rockfish, but also salmon, by looking at fishermen to donate essentially their stomachs of fish that they caught for diving policies. And there are general patterns. So, which is really encouraging that our birds are essentially what they're eating is reflecting the larger environment, as it were. So when there are years with a lot of herring, the birds tend to eat more herring, and also so do the salmon and rockfish, and presumably other species in the area too. So hopefully we can learn more about not just birds, but also about other things within the ecosystem as well.
Awesome. This is a comment, not a question, but Allison says, thank you for answering all of my questions. Sorry there were so many, and I just want to say absolutely no problem. We love an engaged discussion.
Yeah, happily. And my email is up there, or the Birds with Fish email is up there. But you'll primarily be talking to me. And if you think of anything else, I'd love to answer them at another time. So thank you so much.
And I'll just add, I'll be emailing everybody who both attended and registered, if there's folks who weren't able to attend, but once this recording is up on our website, and I will make sure to include all of this contact information in that email as well. So check your inboxes in a couple of days, and you'll have Will's contact info there, as well as the link to upload your photos if you have any.
Well, thank you so much, Will. If you'll stop sharing, I will also share other community science opportunities. A couple other projects locally that you can get involved in, as well as the Birds with Fish is a rackline project, and that contact the Christmas bird count. And I encourage you to, if you enjoyed this webinar tonight, November 5th, it'll be all about the Christmas bird count. It's a lot of fun. There's also another opportunity you can do right from your home, the Great Backyard Bird Count. And We are blessed in Lincoln City to have the most ospreys per capita nesting. And Seven Capes leads a community science effort on osprey awareness and initiative where you monitor a nest. So those are just some opportunities. But thank you all for the audience. You made this possible. For more information about this webinar and upcoming webinars, visit our website, sevencapes.org. And with that, thank you, Will, once again. Thank you, Nissa, and thank you to all those in the audience, and good night.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.